Over the last 5 years, the humanitarian community has been dealing with crises that have affected more people, lasted longer, and required more resources than in previous decades. Every year, over 100 million people need urgent, life-saving humanitarian assistance. In some countries, humanitarian needs continue to grow, mainly because of unresolved conflict. Violence propels entire communities to flee in search of safety. In 2017 alone, 44,400 people were forced to flee their homes every day.
البلاد يعني منتهي تماما. الناس يعني مشردين مساكين ضايعين لا عمل ولا مشغله ويقعدوا ينتظروا الهاونات والقصف والضرب كل ليله حتى انه ما يناموش يمكن برا فحطنا لنا العدد. اذا كنا احنا مثلا ما حصلناش بيت في المنطقه دي كنا ممكن نحن نجي ساعه في اي شارع من احنا خيمه ولا عشه ونمشي حالنا. والحمد لله الآن ندبر أمورنا مرة كذا تبديل أطلاق من هذه الدبابة البلاستيكية يعني صعبة يعني الحياة والمعيشة صعبة.
Many of those who flee violence remain trapped in conflict zones while searching for safety in their home country. Others cross borders to seek refuge abroad.
Tara kiyoye mani kakawuru sulor moge military zalar mani dorilo jar gor gunari lor engorer zalarar tarpor side guli mana mari shuru lara yo yeri guli mare manush kadi falar bom fuder guli mare eddu mama la wada arar rifuse bangladesh tash nara dilon nai jinis barmatu jinis ke suani na fari dujur horani yazunia azura arazura kantaminua gogonji.
As of the end of 2017, 68.5 million people were displaced by conflict or violence, an increase of nearly 10 million in just 3 years. However, people are not forced to leave their homes and livelihoods only because of conflicts. The changing climate is a major force to be reckoned with. The number of disasters caused by extreme weather events is on the rise. An average of 345 disasters a year affect about 350 million people a year. Some 2 billion people live in fragile parts of the world and are extremely vulnerable to the impact of conflicts and disasters.
Di situ saya sudah panik, langsung lari saya ke atas. Belum sampai 10 menit saya di atas, langsung dia goyang keras itu. Sekarang kita mau kembali ke pemukiman kita sekarang ini, sekarang sudah rusak semua. Yang rusak ini rata-rata ya 100%. Jadi mau kemana lah nasibnya nelayan di sini sekarang ini. Ya Allah, kejadian. Tunggu satu kali ini lah kejadian untuk kan di wilayah kita, ya Allah.
Food insecurity is high on the agenda again. Hunger is back to the levels experienced in 2010. More than 820 million people are food insecure across the world. A wave of horrific conflicts, in some cases linked with terrorism and extremist insurgencies, has also created enormous needs. The cost of responding to crises has also gone up because of ever higher standards in meeting humanitarian need. Today, humanitarian response focuses not only on minimum life-saving requirements, like food, shelter, and water, but also covers better health, education and protection, especially for women and girls, and the restoration of people's livelihoods. With increased needs, the international community has risen to the challenge by providing increased funding. Yet, the funding gap still hovers at around 40%. Next year, the United Nations and other humanitarian organizations aim to reach 94 million people and will require more than $21.9 billion to meet their essential needs. Now, more than ever, the world needs to invest in humanity.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to help us launch the Global Humanitarian Overview and also the World Humanitarian Data and Trends document. This is a social media friendly environment. Please tweet as we go along. The hashtag is #InvestInHumanity. Thank you very much to my colleagues, my friends, the UN agency heads, Alexandra, who's a specialist on displaced people, my friend and brother Atu Mitiku from Ethiopia, and Caroline from CARE, and especially thank you for agreeing to moderate the event, Claire. I also want, at the beginning, I'll come back to this, to thank our donors for everything you've done. The humanitarian system reaches tens of millions of people every year, unquestionably saves millions of lives, and none of that would happen without your generosity, including your support for the things that I have a personal responsibility for, the pooled fund. So thank you very much indeed, and I will come back to that. What I want to do in my sort of presentation to you is start by just saying what the GHO is. It is, I think, the world's most sophisticated, authoritative and comprehensive assessment of what humanitarian needs will be in the year ahead, of the response plans that the UN agencies have put together, both the refugee response plans, which Filippo plays a leading role on, but also the humanitarian response plans, and the resources that we will need to make those responses. And this product is the work of thousands and thousands of people in all our agencies. And I want to thank all those people, including hundreds of colleagues in my own office, because it's my view, and you'll all be able to dissect and analyse and see whether you agree with it. But I think this year's version of the GHO is the best one we have produced. It is our intention to make it better year on year, but we can only do that with the brilliant work of all our colleagues. So that's what the GHO is. The next thing I want to talk about is what we're seeing in terms of global trends and challenges, picking up some of the points that were made in the video. You know, the world has improved a lot in recent decades, and for most people on the planet, life is a little bit better than it used to be, but it's still the case that 1 person in 70 around the world is caught up in crises and urgently needs humanitarian assistance and protection. Those 70 million people who are displaced, you just heard about in the video, those people caught up in rising food insecurity, which I'm sure David will touch on. We know especially that crises disproportionately affect girls. Girls are 2.5 times more likely to be out of school in crises than boys are. We know that humanitarian crises are lasting longer than they used to, on average 9 years now. But we also know that humanitarian organisations are increasingly successful in saving lives and reducing suffering. 2018 will be a record year of fundraising for the global humanitarian system, for the whole system globally, including the Red Cross, who launched their important appeal, which I strongly support yesterday, the ICRC appeal for $2 billion. When you add their work, all the work independently financed of the NGOs with the UN, what you see for 2018 is that something like $22 billion, a record, has been raised to finance humanitarian action. Last year's figure was about $21.5 billion. Within the UN, and we have the largest share of that $22 billion, this year our funding will be, by the end of the year, at least 10% higher than last year's record funding. As of today, the funding is $14.3 billion. We've given you in the document what it was 2 weeks ago when we put the document to bed, but the money's still coming in, and it's already clear that it will be a record fundraising year. It's also clear that the gap between the needs and the money we've raised is closing. And I want to say a word about why that's happening. And I think the reasons are a combination of the credibility of our assessment of needs and the confidence that our donors have that if they resource us, we will use the money well. And of course, we feel a strong responsibility to do better on assessing needs, to do better on improving response plans, in order further to build the confidence of donors that we're worth investing in and humanitarian action remains, as it is, one of the cheapest ways of saving a life. Now, I want to say a few words about the outlook and the requirements for 2019. Humanitarian needs are going to remain extremely high in 2019. You've seen the figures in the video. Overall, the needs are comparable to those of 2018, but some places are getting worse and other places are improving. Most need in 2019 will be in long-lasting crises in which there's been limited progress in addressing the root causes. So a big priority for 2019 is going to be for us collectively to do better on finding the political solutions to security and conflict crises and in accelerating development activity and poverty reduction in the places where they are at the core of the root of the crisis. Conflict is going to remain the main driver of humanitarian needs in 2019, and food insecurity, increasingly related to conflict, is going to be a major concern as well. There's an 80% chance of an El Niño event developing at the end of this year, and we project that 25 countries will be at high risk from droughts and cyclones and floods coming out of the El Niño. Let me say a word about how the situation varies country by country. The biggest humanitarian crisis we expect to have to deal with in 2019 is the crisis in Yemen. We think that 24 million people will need humanitarian assistance in Yemen. The UN plans to meet the needs of 15 million of those people. David and I have just been to Yemen. The humanitarian agencies have scaled up from reaching 3 million people a month in Yemen last year to 8 million with food assistance this year. And David and his team have a plan to reach 12 million in 2019. And that is a mark of the deterioration of the situation. Unfortunately, there are some other countries where we are projecting a deterioration as well, and they include Afghanistan, and a number of us were involved in the conference on Afghanistan last week. They also include Cameroon and the Central African Republic. There are, though, also a significant number of places where the situation is improving, and they include Burundi and Haiti and Iraq and Somalia. They also include 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Mauritania and Senegal, for which the improvement has been such that we in fact do not need a humanitarian response plan next year. We can try and encourage the world to focus on the development agenda in those countries rather than the acute humanitarian needs, and that's a success measure. There will be remaining very high levels of need in the countries where most of the resources have been required in recent years, and that includes Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria and South Sudan. It also includes Ethiopia, but the situation, as Atu Mitiku will describe, has improved significantly in Ethiopia, and there's scope for a lot more improvement there, but there is a need for humanitarian assistance at the moment, especially to deal with the displacement challenge, which the government is working very hard on. There is one crisis this year for which we have, for the first time, a response plan, and that relates to the situation for people leaving Venezuela. And I'm sure Filippo will touch a bit more on that because he has got more work in train and more events coming up on it. Let me tell you in my final few minutes just a bit about how we're going to improve the humanitarian response next year. The figure that we've quoted in the document of financial needs is for $21.9 billion. That does not include the financing costs of our work inside Syria, because we've got more work to do on assessing needs and doing the response planning inside Syria. If, as is plausible, the needs inside Syria are comparable next year to this year, then what we will be looking for is the largest total pot that we've ever sought in terms of funding for next year. It'll be about $25.3 billion, about $400 million more than we sought for this year. But we will confirm that when we finalise the needs assessment and the response planning in February. And I think lots of you in the room are familiar with the process we're going through there. And it's about improving the quality of our understanding of needs and how we can respond to them. We're going to be working collectively to improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of the humanitarian response system during the course of 2019. Wherever possible, we're going to be using cash-based assistance to meet people's needs. And a number of us will be issuing a statement tomorrow, I think myself quite an important statement, on how we're going to be collaborating to strengthen the use of cash in humanitarian settings. So I know this is a slightly nerdy professional community point, but I encourage those of you for whom this is an issue just to watch out for what we're going to be releasing tomorrow. We're going to be trying to strengthen our focus and attention on practical measures that can enhance respect for international humanitarian law in conflict. Conflict, as I said earlier, is the single biggest cause of humanitarian suffering, and we're looking at practical ways to improve access and get better compliance. In my own office, we are strengthening our capability on civ-mil coordination by having quite a lot more people in our field offices with a professional background and experience in that area, and I know others are doing the same thing. We're going to have a substantial uptick in measures to protect people from sexual exploitation and abuse. And yesterday, David Filippo and I and our colleagues in the Interagency Standing Committee agreed a package of new measures to strengthen work on PSA and SHA at the country level. And as you'll see in the document, we've got quite a detailed description in the last 2 pages of all the things we're going to be doing in that area. We're aiming to strengthen our coordination with development partners, recognising that humanitarian assistance reduces suffering and saves lives, but doesn't solve the underlying challenges, and that requires, in many places, development and faster progress in poverty reduction. Lastly, we are going to have a series of high-level events next year to bring attention to some of the major issues, to promote policy discussion, and also to seek resources. So the European Union have already announced that they will be hosting an event on Syria. The Secretary-General has announced that he will host an event in February on Yemen. We want to host an event on the Central African Republic. We're also going to have some thematic events, including an event on trying to do better to protect women and girls in humanitarian settings, which we're going to be hosting with the government of Norway. And we hope we can also make use of the fact that 2019 is the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions to have a series of events on this problem of getting better compliance from belligerents in conflicts. So thank you very much indeed. That is my summary for you of the overview, and I'm now going to hand over to Claire.
Thank you. Well, my main task is to be the traffic cop and the time manager, and to keep people on time, because as you can see, we really do have the experts at the table on this issue. And I want to leave time for you, the audience. I always say the audience are the most important people at these events, to ask questions of the experts. So the focus is definitely preventing these protracted emergencies. As Mark says, the long-lasting emergencies, those that on average last 9 years. And how do we stop them from becoming the new norm? So let me go to Filippo straight away and just ask, from your perspective, what are the needs that you have in these protracted emergencies, these long-lasting emergencies, and how are you addressing them?
Thank you. And, you know, if the question is, are protracted humanitarian crises becoming the norm, I'm afraid Unfortunately, they are. Unless we reverse this trend, this is the direction in which we're moving. And this is essentially linked to the fact that solving the solutions to this crisis, as Mark already spoke about, are becoming more and more elusive, be they solutions linked to political processes. Let's hope talks about Yemen are fruitful this week, or at least open up a new avenue for peace. But we've been disappointed before. Or be they solutions that encompass developmental aspects. I'm sure David will speak more in relation to food security about that. And often these things are more and more, or almost always, are interlinked. And this is why this overview that you are receiving today, you're reading today, includes still some of the most protracted situations, humanitarian situations in the world, from Afghanistan to Somalia to Palestine. But also it includes, if the benchmark is 9 years, I don't know, I guess this is just a conventional benchmark. Syria only has another year to go before it reaches that category. And frankly, if you look at newer crises or recently aggravated crises like the Rohingya refugee crisis, refugee from Myanmar to Bangladesh, the hallmarks for protracted situation are beginning to build up unless we address them. So that's the concern. And finally, maybe another concern, we see a lot of what I would call, I don't know if they're new or protracted, they're chronic, recurring crises. South Sudan, Burundi. It's good that there are some improvements. I hope they will be durable enough not to recur as we have seen in the past 20 years. In all these crises, I would like to add, forced displacement features prominently. Of course, you will see in this publication, in the Global Overview, that there are 4 or 5 specific refugee appeals. South Sudan, Burundi, Nigeria, DRC. But throughout in the series of various situations, most of them have a significant displacement component, either internal displacement or external displacement. The features of this protracted crisis, the negative features are, of course, that because they're protracted, an obvious conclusion, they generate fatigue among donors, but increasingly, and especially in an environment in which the issue I deal with, refugees, is becoming more politicized and more complex, there is also what I would call host fatigue, not just donor fatigue, host fatigue, and one feeds into the other. And we have seen situations in which calls for, or even pressures for a precipitous solution have emerged very prominently. Some of it, of course, is understandable. If hosts don't see the same level of support as protracting itself, like the crisis, the reaction will be that. The question was also, what are the needs? The needs of protracted crisis, obviously, as the video also pointed out, are medium, longer term in nature. Education, livelihoods, support to the local community that is greatly impacted by this crisis, especially refugee crisis, damage to the environment, need to sustain services and infrastructure. These are all areas that for a long time, I have to say, have been under-responded to or neglected. And this, in turn, has generated the host fatigue. In the worst cases, it has generated, in refugee situations in particular, phenomena of xenophobia that are quite worrying. So my conclusion here is that are two, perhaps. On the one hand, we are about to have, hopefully, the General Assembly adopt 2 global compacts, one on safe and orderly migration and one on refugees. Let me focus especially on the refugee compact. The gist of the refugee compact is really to broaden the coalition of responders to this crisis in order to supplement and complement traditional humanitarian responses. In particular, the role of the private sector, of civil society, but also of development organizations can address and are already addressing, for example, in the 15 countries in which we are carrying out this new approach called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, they're complementing the humanitarian assistance by investing more, even bilaterally, in education, in livelihoods, in host communities, in sustainable energy, and so forth. But then, back to humanitarian assistance, development assistance should not be instead of, should be additional to the continuous need for humanitarian assistance, which is really what this appeal is calling for. Even in protracted situation, unfortunately, because the underlying causes have not been addressed, we see humanitarian needs being very acute. In Syria, where we've had for several years, together with UNDP, an approach to appeals that is, and it is in here, that encompasses short and medium-term needs, we see those short-term needs still very acute in winter, for example, or in protection terms. These are urgent needs that the humanitarian overview wants to focus on. And the final point, because some of you may have followed in the last few days quite a lot of media traffic and media exchanges on management issues, integrity issues I'm talking about UNHCR here, about our programs in Uganda. There's been in the past similar instances. Of course, all of us work in situations of high risk from the point of view of the integrity of programs, and we need to remain vigilant. All I can say more if needed, is that, of course, we have responded and we continue to respond to those crises with transparency, decisive measures. We're very well aware that when we ask for $30 billion, we have even more of a duty to ensure the integrity of those resources that taxpayers are putting on the table, and we are fully committed to doing that.
Thank you very much. So you can see that was an open invitation to ask Filippo anything during the Q&A session. And thank you very much. Yes, indeed, the way that we're going to deal with these long-lasting emergencies is, of course, a broad coalition and a deep coalition that includes development too. I just wanted to quickly pick up, even though it's not a protracted emergency at the moment, and let's hope that it doesn't become one, because Mark was mentioning Venezuela. This is a new one with this mass outflow from the country to the neighboring countries. Can you very briefly tell us how you're addressing that?
Yes. There's been an outflow of Venezuelans for some years. It has escalated in recent months or couple of years. We estimate, and since the beginning of this outflow, this is already a few years back, about 3 million people have left the country. Most of them have been hosted in countries in the region through a variety of stay arrangement, residency arrangement, which are actually very significant because they indicate that that's a region in which solidarity is very strong. Let's not forget that Venezuela for decades was a country receiving migrants and refugees and giving them hospitality. So that solidarity continues to be useful to people on the move for a variety of reasons. There are many. They range from the purely material to fleeing violence and other phenomena. So it's a complex situation. The Secretary General of the UN has asked the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and UNHCR to form a platform to coordinate the humanitarian response. We're doing this in close coordination with states in the region, but we are also, whilst looking at humanitarian needs and protection needs, because there's a lot of risk for especially women, children, to be exposed to exploitation, to trafficking. Whilst we look at these shorter-term needs, we are, from the beginning of a crisis, if you wish, trying to bring in also development actors to support the education and health systems, for example, and the labor market in these countries, so that this huge presence of Venezuelans does not become too much of a burden. And this global overview includes already a summary of a joint appeal that IOM and UNHCR will present here in Geneva on the 14th of December for a total amount of $738 million for next year.
Thank you very much for talking to us about Venezuela. And of course, you were mentioning that women and children are a great threat during that crisis. And I would like to move now to the Secretary General of CARE International, Caroline, because I think that many people in this room are aware that often the voices of women are not heard. And I'd like to get your thoughts on why is this and what can be done.
Thank you, Claire, and it's a pleasure to be on this very important panel today. And I think I just want to make two very important overall points. And the first is that in crisis, and particularly in protracted crisis, there are actually opportunities to drive positive change for women and girls. And I think we sometimes forget that. So we have a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. And I think to seize these opportunities, we at CARE recognise that we must work with local women's groups, and locally driven development is something that we're really, really trying to focus on a lot more in these complex situations. So I think many of us in this room, we all know that when a crisis or an emergency hits, women and girls are the most affected. And it could be to do with their skill set, it's their responsibilities, their social norms, and the family norms as well. And in reality, women are most likely to drown, they could be trapped in their houses, they're unable to flee to safety, and in times when there are a food crisis, they are often the last to eat the food at a family meal. But if we look at the after effects of an emergency also, this also takes a high toll on women and girls. And I think we all know very well that issues of rape, trafficking, early marriage, and other forms of violence against women increase in times of conflict and natural disaster. 1 in 5 refugees or displaced women in complex humanitarian settings are estimated to have experienced some form of sexual violence. And this is a reality that we often don't talk about or often don't realise. And I'd like to just underline a point that Mark made also. Even in something as simple as access to education in these complex crises, it is the boys who are getting the education more than the girls. At the same time, women's voices are often not heard when emergency aid is being planned and delivered. And when emergency assessments and responses are planned by men, the specific needs of women and girls are overlooked. And we know this, right? We know when we are in a situation of planning, even if it's an emergency situation, we need both to talk to boys and girls, and we need the women and men at the table. It's the same when we're trying to design development projects. We've understood this in the development sector, and we're beginning to understand this better in the humanitarian sector. But I really want to focus that we are finding that conflicts and emergencies, like I mentioned, are opportunities for women and girls, that there are opportunities to do things differently. So we can see that women and girls are victims, but they're not just victims. They are also active and indeed powerful agents of change. And we at CARE, what we are learning is that when social structures and power dynamics are disrupted, women and girls often find themselves with a voice for the first time in their lives. And I just want to bring in very quickly the issues in Yemen. And in fact, Mark was there last week with our country director talking about the situation in Yemen, and it's a very complex situation, and to be frank, the context is worsening. And what we do at CARE, we're reaching over 1 million people per month, and we're working with David's organisation, WFP, as well. But what we're also trying to do, we're trying to understand this situation from a gender point of view. How can we work more effectively with women? And in Yemen, we're actually designing projects that are specifically designed for women's economic empowerment in this very complex situation. And the feedback we're getting is this is appreciated by both men and women. The men are saying this is excellent, that the women are able to leave the house and do some economic activities, and this is changing the dynamic within the household. And I think we're seeing the same in Syria too, which is another protracted crisis. And if we're trying to work a little bit more with the women, but also working with the men, we're seeing some kind of shift in the social roles. And the women's economic empowerment in Syria has always been quite low, but as we're trying to work, there was legal barriers and social barriers, but women are beginning to have greater roles both inside and outside the household. So this is why gender is so critical in all emergencies, but particularly in protracted crises, where there is a risk that women and girls will suffer the most, but also an opportunity to transform their social norms, their place in the family, and their agency in a rapidly changing situation. And that is why working with these local partners and women from effective communities is critical. And the point I really want to make, which is vital when we're in these types of situation, women understand the social dynamics, the social capital from their communities. It may have been disrupted, but they have great knowledge. They are the managers in a crisis. They are the ones who are really fighting hard to make things work in a crisis. And we need to recognize that when we're doing an emergency response. And we had a great discussion last week, actually, in Geneva at the UK Embassy, where we had a group of women explaining what they were doing and how they had survived in a crisis. But there is a crisis, actually, in funding, and how do we get funding into these locally driven groups? So this is something that is very challenging. We know it works. We've seen it work at CARE, but the sustainability of the financing is a big challenge. And my final point, really, Claire, is, and this is what Mark had mentioned too, we know that we need to do something about poverty reduction. And therefore, we know that this continuum between humanitarian and development is vital. And at CARE, we do both. We're structured that way. And I think there's a recognition globally that we need to see how we can connect these sectors together. They are driven very differently. They're delivered very differently. They're done by different people. But we need to bring these two aspects much more closely together.
Thank you very much for your remarks, and perhaps we'll discuss funding and financing all together in a moment, because obviously that is an issue. I just was listening to you there, and you're talking about empowering women, which is obviously very important. And I know that sometimes people in these very difficult situations, I mean, they're good people in difficult situations, and often they're seen as beneficiaries rather than as enablers and people who can actually do things for themselves. I mean, do you think that the humanitarian community needs to change the way that it responds or views people, good people in difficult situations?
No, Claire, I think you've raised a very critical point, and I think there's a big recognition across the humanitarian sector that we're all trying to do things differently. I mean, the humanitarian sector has been incredibly successful. I mean, I think that's amazing. If when you go to the field and you see the work of the this sector and how they deliver the responses, it's very, very impressive. But like Mark says, we can be more efficient, we can be more effective. And ultimately, it is about including the people in the process. And sometimes that's very, very difficult, but other times it is possible. And it's understanding that the situation has a different impact on social groups as well as men and women, and understanding that complex dynamic underneath. And I think it's also important to recognize where governments can lead, where governments can take a role of being able to better get access to the funding and deliver the funding, because some countries are able to do that more than others. So I think there's something there about the delivery, where the financing goes, and how we work with the dynamic social complexes at the community levels. We need to understand exactly what is going on at the community level in order to be able to empower rather than disempower.
Thank you. And indeed, picking up on your point about the importance of working with local women's groups, working really with people, but also with governments, I think that leads me nicely on to you, Sir Mitiko, because we heard from Mark that Ethiopian humanitarian needs are still going to remain high, although there has been some improvement. So if I could just first of all ask you about how do you work with these international organizations and with national partners so that we get the best use of resources?
Thank you, Claire. Excellencies, as you all may know, Ethiopia, because of its geographic location in the Horn of Africa, its geopolitics and diverse ethnic environment, is vulnerable to climate-induced disasters, mainly to El Nino, La Nina, negative Indian Ocean dipole, droughts and floods, as well as conflict-induced displacement. As a result, Ethiopia and its humanitarian partners have strong, efficient, and effective coordination mechanism at a national, at a regional, and at a local level. There are 3 levels of coordination mechanisms. The first one is strategic multi-agency coordination, which is chaired by the National Disaster Risk Management Commission Commissioner and UN resident and humanitarian coordinator, who is stationed in Addis Ababa. So it has members from UN agencies, bilaterals, major international NGOs, and respective government line ministries. It is responsible to strategic issues. It gives direction, and it makes a decision which will be implemented by the technical working group comprising of a number of UN agencies, bilaterals, international NGOs, and line ministries. So the decisions and directions are focusing on need assessment, multi-agency need assessment, joint response, preparing joint response plan, setting a response priority, a joint appeal to the international community, joint monitoring and evaluation. This is a strong mechanism to use the resources that we have get from our donors, from humanitarian as well as those donors who are working in humanitarian area, in their own program, which they could make it scalable and dedicate resource for the humanitarian assistance. The second coordination mechanism, the Disaster Risk Management Technical Working Group, which is chaired by the National Disaster Risk Management Commission and UN OCHA country director, with the members, as I mentioned earlier, from UN agencies, bilaterals, international NGOs, and some major local NGOs who are working in humanitarian intervention. It is tasked to implement the decisions that have been made by the strategic multi-agency coordination team. And also it is tasked to bring strategic issues to the attention of the strategic coordination mechanism in order to get decisions for the fast and effective implementation in all drought and flood as well as conflict-affected area. The third level of the coordination is, it is sectoral one, it is cluster. We do have a number of clusters, namely agriculture and livestock, water and sanitation, health and nutrition, food, non-food items and shelter and protection, as well as education. Each clusters have been chaired by respective UN agencies, namely WHO, UNICEF, World Food Programme, UN OCHA, IOM, UNHCR, and others with respective line ministries. These are the structures that helped us to combat well all climate-induced and conflict-induced disasters in all parts of the country. For your information, last year we had one incident, the conflict incident in the southern part of Ethiopia, the place which is called Gedo and Guji. Around 840,000 people were displaced in such areas. To manage to operate the response operation, we established Emergency Coordination Center, EOC. In one EOC, we were able to coordinate 41 partners with 427 staff members. This shows how Ethiopia does have a strong coordination mechanism with its humanitarian partners.
Thank you very much for that impressive coordination plan. The Global Humanitarian Overview is all about helping people improve their humanitarian response next year. Can you very briefly just give us an insight in what you're going to change and what you're going to improve next year?
Well, as you may know, Ethiopia has been receiving emergency aid since 1974. The famine which was occurred in the northern part of Ethiopia and which made visible by the British journalist and the filmmaker Jonathan Dimbleby. Since then, the government as well as our humanitarian development partners are responding for humanitarian needs. So that we learned that humanitarian assistance could save the lives, but it could not bring durable solution. That is why we learned that the new way of working, humanitarian development peace nexus is a key to bring a durable solution. And we started the development humanitarian nexus planning last year. The 2018 humanitarian disaster resilient plan shows that 3 pillars. Pillar 1, prevention and mitigation. Pillar 2, preparedness and response. Pillar 3, national system building and recovery and rehabilitation. Even though we prepared the plan in such a way, we are not able to secure enough resource for Pillar 1 and Pillar 3. It is overlooked by the partners. The security resource is less than 7%. So for 2019, we have a plan to make the response part, Pillar 2, more bold and visible to the donors, to have adequate resource to respond for the needs, as rightly mentioned by Mr. Mark earlier. The number remains high. We expect that 8 million, an increment of 40% in terms of beneficiary number, and 34% in terms of required resource, so that we have a plan to make the response part more visible and bold, to attain the attention of the donors and partners who are working with the Ethiopian government. This is the first thing. The second thing, at the same time, we are working on the root cause of hazardous and associated disasters. Otherwise, we cannot go long period of time with this situation, humanitarian situation, so that we have to contain and we have to prevent protracted crisis in the Ethiopian context. This is a plan that we are going to prepare for the 2019 response.
Thank you very, very much. And I think we've all been mentioning the Global Humanitarian Overview, but also it's the launch of the World Humanitarian Data and Trends Report, which brings me to Alexandra, who's the data guru, perhaps. And of course, we all know that planning and response can be only as good as the data that you get. So I just wondered whether you can bring us up to date on the progress in gathering data.
Thank you very much, Claire. And thanks, Mr. Lecoq and OCHA, for inviting us to be part of this panel. I think it's fair to say that paradoxically, the levels of crises that we've seen over the last decade have been matched by a massive progress and massive advances in data collection and analysis. And I guess that is a positive thing that needs to be acknowledged. We've come a long way, basically, since we started monitoring displacement 20 years ago, and we're now accessing so many different sources of data on the ground that are allowing us to report so much more accurately, not just on the scope and the scale of the phenomenon of internal displacement in the case of IDMC, but also on the severity of the needs that we're seeing across the world. As I was saying only just the other day, back in 1998, we were speaking of displacement predominantly as a byproduct of conflict, whereas now we are recognizing that it is very much a multi-causal and a multi-dimensional issue. And we're not just reporting on displacement in conflict-affected countries, we're actually now reporting on over 150 countries across the world. So we've got a pretty good sense of the full scale of the phenomenon. Which is the first step in ensuring a better response. And we also have a good sense of what it looks like in different contexts. And it's hugely diverse as a phenomenon. It varies from, of course, the immediate picture that comes to mind, armed attacks and direct threats to people's physical safety and security. But it can also take the form of government evacuations, like what we see regularly in the case of Asia, when governments are responding to typhoons, they're evacuating people to prepare for hurricanes in the Atlantic. We've even seen more recently people being displaced by wildfires in California. It also includes people escaping gang violence in Central America, communities that are pushed off their lands to make way for major infrastructural projects, but also communities, for example, in the Pacific, that are facing irreversible environmental changes that could lead them to becoming permanently displaced. So across all these situations, we're seeing, yes, very much a humanitarian urgency. It's not just a link to humanitarian needs are not just happening in conflict contexts. We're seeing humanitarian emergencies there as well, but we are also seeing, and I want to echo what Mr. Grandi was saying earlier, is that yes, protracted displacement is very much the norm. There isn't even a question about that anymore, and that includes in disaster contexts. It's very rare to find a displacement situation that gets resolved in a matter of days or weeks. Or months, or even just a couple of years. Anyway, so we owe this global picture, which is a pretty good global picture, to a very rich ecosystem of data collectors and analysts on the ground. And that ranges, of course, from OCHA's HNOs and lots of other data efforts to IOM's DTM, UNHCR's site monitoring, but also the access that we get to government databases, to civil society assessments, and to media reports. So there's a rich plethora of actors on the ground, both public and private, who are helping us collect that data. So we're very impressed by the collective efforts that have been made over the years to come up with better, but also more frequent and more consistent and collaborative approaches to data collection. Maybe just to give a few examples of key areas of progress. One of the key areas has been our collective investment in the development of innovative tools and methods to fill what I have to still acknowledge are major data gaps, where the picture is by no means complete. We still face a lot of data gaps, and because we know that there are some logistical constraints on the ground, some security constraints, some political ones, we have to innovate, and we need to somehow fill those gaps. So we've developed, again, as a collective, we've invested so much in developing data sharing platforms. We've invested in predictive analytics. We've used satellite imagery to infer displacement from damaged housing. We've partnered with mobile phone companies to track people on the move. We're working much more now across disciplines, and I find that very interesting. We are working more across these disciplines now to link the phenomenon of displacement to other social, economic, or political factors. So to say something about the work of the World Food Programme, we are working with WFP now to link up food security, livelihoods, drought, and conflict indicators so that we can better estimate and track drought-related displacement across areas of sub-Saharan Africa and even Asia. Now, that for me is going to have to be an area that we invest far more in the future. We're also partnering with UNICEF that will allow us, this partnership is going to allow us to provide the much needed gender and age disaggregated picture that we need so that we can analyze in more detail what this displacement means for different demographic groups, and so that we can make sure that the response is also disaggregated by those needs. Another example is the work that's currently being done by a number of us, so data partners, but also international NGO partners and UN agencies, to better understand the scope and the scale of displacement in urban areas. I look forward to reading the overview. I hope that there's a section on urban challenges and urban displacement as well, because we are seeing that is very much going to be an area of work that needs far more research and understanding. We need to be sure that we're responding to the needs of those people who are often living invisibly in these urban areas, but also that in providing the support, we're also supporting the right kinds of governance systems at the municipal levels and not creating new layers of displacement or urban risk. Perhaps another example of progress is how we've been able to analyze sources of big data to detect incidents of displacement that were not previously on our radar screen. And we're able now to report on displacement in near real time. Now that, of course, has a direct advantage for humanitarian responders, but that kind of more consistent monitoring of displacement flows is also what's going to enable us to build a more robust evidence base to project into the future and to start working on more sort of anticipatory analytics. We've also got much better geographical coverage and logistical capacity to track the monitoring of different movements of populations, or what we call displacement flows, during a crisis. And I'd like to insist on that point, because it's a point that IDMC often makes, and we do make it repeatedly, but it's so important to be able to track different movements of people within a time frame during a crisis, because we need to be able, again, it's about being more targeted in the response. We need to be able to distinguish new displacements from secondary or repeated movements, and we need to be able to then make sense of why the cumulative numbers, the stock figures, are increasing or decreasing. Again, Mr. Grandi was referring to the situation of chronic crises, and indeed those repeated displacement events that are affecting certain populations across sub-Saharan Africa. I'm thinking of the DRC as a case in point. We need to understand how those repeated shocks to the systems are affecting individuals, communities, but also the wider sort of national political and economic systems within which they work. So disaggregating those different movements of populations are key for us, and we have made much progress thanks to our partners on the ground in monitoring those flows. And a last point, again, still linked to the displacement flows, is the progress that we are making. We haven't, we're not completely there yet, but in tracking return flows in a much more accurate and systematic way. This is really critical for ensuring that the needs of returnees are tracked far beyond their point of arrival back in their country of origin or their area of origin, and that their needs don't worsen over time. So we are getting better now at not just saying this person has returned and washing our hands of them, but actually putting in place systems that can allow us to monitor their situation over longer periods of time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, on the progress. Very, very briefly, I'm just wondering, because as we've said, protracted emergencies are the new norm. Is there anything that you need to do differently with data to try and prevent these protracted emergencies from becoming the new norm?
Thanks for that question. I'd say two things. It's actually interesting to see how, because of the protractedness of crises and of displacement across the world, we're being asked more and more to provide a very different type of data than we have done up until now. We're asked to provide evidence on how the needs and the vulnerabilities of IDPs actually evolve over time, but also how their needs and their vulnerabilities compare to those of other communities living in the same country or in the same region. So this type of information, of course, is of huge relevance to development actors because they want to make the case that displacement isn't just a humanitarian issue, that it requires a longer-term response, but they also need to be able to demonstrate with hard evidence that in certain cases IDPs or refugees are either poorer than host communities, or that on the other hand, conversely, they can bring positive benefits to that community. So we're being asked more and more for that kind of data, but what we're seeing is that we are embarking on this new area of work. We're trying to quantify sort of the longer-term costs of internal displacement, but we're seeing that it requires a very different type of data sets than what we currently have. It really requires far more investment, like I said, in tracking so many different social, economic, political indicators over long periods of time so that we can come up with consistent and comparable data sets. So that's one thing. And let me just finish on the sort of forecasting, because it's true that more and more, because we're partnering much more now with national governments, we see that national governments, what they need is data that can allow them to project into the future and to prepare more adequately for what may come, for the future crises that may come. And that also requires a very specific type of data. We have already invested in developing a disaster displacement risk model, but applying that also to conflict contexts and then giving the tools to national governments so that they can develop the proper sort of early warning and contingency planning systems, I think is really the future, I would say, of this comprehensive response to displacement.
Thank you. We're talking about data, and some of the data, which I think is in the Global Humanitarian Overview, David, on food insecurity, was that there was 124 million people in 2017, which was a 14% increase on 2016. So it seems to be rising. There had been a promising trend downwards, I understand. So what happened? Why did we get the reversal, and what can we do about it?
Well, it's not just it seems to be rising, it is rising, and the data shows that clearly, and a lot of progress was being made in the world by many of you in this room that have been working together for effective programs that have brought about change and positive change around the world. But in the last 2 years, we've seen a dramatic reversal from what was 777 million people hungry, now is over 821 million. But the severe hunger rate of those who literally are marching towards starvation has risen from 80 million to 124 million people. And these aren't just numbers and statistics. These are little girls and little boys. These are children. These are families. This is the bedrock of stabilized or unstabilized communities. This is the framework by which you have crises that result from it. That's why the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution clearly giving great clarity to the fact that food security is the essential element with regards to conflict and the peace nexus. And so addressing the root cause, as Filippo was talking about, we're now entering in this new era where humanitarian silos and development silos have got to be broken down. And we've got to have more flexibility and more multi-year funding. And what do we do and how do we do it? Because we know when we can go in and be more effective, we can in fact save dollars. This is what happened in Syria, why most of the political leaders in Europe recognized that they reacted too slowly. And you ended up with millions of refugees infiltrated by some extremist groups. And the cost of supporting, or let's say feeding, a Syrian inside Damascus is about 50 cents per day versus that same Syrian in Berlin or Brussels. Total humanitarian support would be 50 euros per day. And the Syrian doesn't want to be in Berlin or Brussels, no offense. But they want to stay where their family has been for hundreds, if not thousands of years. In fact, we will prove based, and this is the bad news and the good news, when you assist 90 some odd million people a year, when you feed that many people, you learn a lot about what they're thinking, what they're experiencing. We found that a Syrian, and this is typical of any other displaced area in the world. They will move 2, 3, 4 times before they'll eventually leave their homeland. You see, people want to stay home. And if we can address the root cause, this is why, even though, like last year, we took humanitarian dollars, working with our donors, and we actually rehabilitated over 500,000 acres of land with 10 million beneficiaries. We planted over 10 million trees. We rehabilitated or built over 17,000 kilometers of roads, over 5,000 kilometers of water canals, over 5,000 holding ponds and small reservoirs and dams and 500 bridges or more. That might not seem that big of a deal, the 500 bridges, but where we do it strategically, for example, in South Sudan, it saved us $70 million in transportation costs by making easier transport routes. And guess what? The traders could then follow behind us, creating economic opportunity. So last year alone, because all of you have been pushing that we be more strategic, more effective, we actually purchased over $500 million worth of commodities from African farmers, smallholder farmers, primarily women today. Homegrown school meals, working with mothers, buying their produce, bring it to their school, helping their children. And when we do these types of programs, rehabilitating land, like in the Sahel region, as I've said on European television, if you think you had concerns with 20 million people destabilizing Syria, the greater Sahel region is 500 million people. And if we can address the root cause with effective programs, which we in the United Nations do have, collaborating where the humanitarian development nexus comes together, giving us that flexibility, we know and have proved experientially when we can take effective dollars, no matter what you call them, with effective programs and complemented with school meals programs and many other nutritious programs, we see migration drop off the chart. We see recruitment by extremist groups drop off the chart. We've seen the marriage rates by 12, 13-year-olds drop off the chart. We see the teen pregnancy rate drop off the chart. We see conflict between the herders and the farmers in these areas drop off the chart. You see, it pays to be effective. It helps to be efficient. We can do both. So we need your continued support, because the problems are getting worse, but we've got to address the root cause. I would like to see us one day put Filippo, UNHCR, and the World Food Program out of business, because we've done our jobs. But we need your help. And with $300 trillion worth of wealth in the world today, this is a small ask. But the consequences for the child who doesn't get the support they need and for the communities in the surrounding neighborhoods is going to be severe. So thank you for letting us share the realities of the day and the hopes that still exist. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that that is a rallying cry, isn't it? That the humanitarians and the development agencies can spend this money wisely with proper planning, proper data. They've been telling you what they've been doing. Of course, there is still a shortfall in the gap, even though it's been decreasing. So please, let me go to you now for the last 15 minutes. Please do ask your questions, or if you're going to make reflections, please keep them relatively short, because I know that we have to wrap up at 11:30. So I'd now like to open the floor to people. Please raise your hand, or if you have a tag in front of you, then I know who's talking. Okay. Is there a lady there from UN Habitat? And if you could just say whether you've got a specific question and who it's for, because obviously we've got many experts around the table.
Thank you very much. I'm Maimuna, the Executive Director of UN Habitat. came all the way from Nairobi to be with all of you in this hall this morning. Yeah, if you know that UN Habitat is ready to be part of the humanitarian effort because many humanitarian crises happen in the cities and human settlement. As you know, cities is an engine of growth, and cities is also center of challenges in humanitarian. And we are here happy to support the work. I would like to this question to IDMC, because I'm very happy to support on the collection of the data, because I think its data is very important. And you talk about the governance, and we work in the cities and human settlement. And then how would you consider UN Habitat to collaborate with you on this humanitarian work, and also in your collection of data and talking about the governance at the local level? Because I have 7 years experience as a mayor before I became the ED of UN Habitat. Just that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, Alexandra was talking about urbanization, and there you have an offer of collaboration from UN Habitat. Please respond.
Thank you very much for reiterating actually your support to our work. And in fact, we are already collaborating with your colleagues at UN Habitat. I'm happy to talk to you after the event, perhaps about the details, but very happy to collaborate with you. And as I said, this has to be a global partnership that involves both NGOs, but also UN agencies, and UN Habitat is the obvious partner. And perhaps just to say, if we can have a talk later, but we will be launching our next global report on internal displacement that will have a focus on urban internal displacement. And we hope to be able to bring that work down to as I said, to the municipal level in the coming years. So if you have any insights on how we should do that, I'd be happy to hear them. Thanks.
Thank you. It always is useful if you sit right in front of the moderator. So I'm going to take, first of all, a question from the European Union and then the United Kingdom. So the European Union, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, colleague excellencies. Excuse me. First of all, thanks to Undersecretary General Lowcock for this report, for all the colleagues who have been working hard on it, and we look forward to reading it and appreciate all the effort in improving the way of working of OCHA. Just a few words from our side. We don't have a budget yet for next year, but we expect to be able to stay the course next year. We have, from our side, of course, a number of priorities. First of all, Syria, and thank you for mentioning the Brussels conference that we hope to be able to announce a date for soon, probably in the beginning of April. We also note the particular mention you made of Yemen, and we will be happy also to see how we can help mobilize international attention to that and to continue doing so. Commissioner Stylianides was here last week, just to repeat a few things that he said. First of all, our focus on forgotten crises, 15% of our funding, and also what he said that we hope to be able to increase the part of funding for education in emergencies to 10% next year, up from 8% this year, and up from quite a much lower level in the past. We also continue to focus a lot on gender-based violence in emergencies. The call to action we have been chairing now, we are happy to hand over to Canada. It remains a particular priority for us. Thank you very much for mentioning the nexus. This is important for us. We do our best in Brussels to mobilize our development colleagues. We have a big discussion about our future development programs and budget and strategy. So this is important and interesting for us. Thanks also for mentioning the World Humanitarian Data and Trends report. Efficiency data is important, so thanks to everybody working on this. Thanks to Alexander for reminding us of this, and particularly mention the Humanitarian Data Center in The Hague. And now, and with apologies, my question. System governance is important, as we know. We know that the Secretary General is working hard on his reform agenda. How do you see in the coming year this work impacting and improving the work on the humanitarian front? We'll be very interested. Perhaps a question for Mr. Lowcock in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The question on system governance and how to improve it.
Well, very briefly, because I know time's against us. There's two levels to this. The first is what we can do within the humanitarian community to collaborate more effectively and solve problems faster and more cheaply. And Filippo, David and I, with our colleagues in the Interagency Standing Committee, were discussing all the big crises yesterday and how we're going to collaborate on dealing with them. And the more we work together, formally and informally, the better the collective response is going to be. One of the characteristics of every single crisis that we're dealing with is that no one agency can fix it. We have to collaborate and coordinate our efforts if we want the fastest, cheapest and best response. So that's within the humanitarian ecosystem or system, whatever you want to call it. At the bigger level, I just really want to echo what David and Filippo have said. We need to make every humanitarian dollar work harder for development gains. And the governance framework for that is the joining up of, within the UN, the humanitarian system with the development system. And 2-3 weeks ago in New York at the Chief Executives Board meeting, we were all working on that. I think what we feel is we need to make this as practical as possible. So we need to find places like the Lake Chad Basin and the Horn of Africa where we're doing well, keep doing better in those places, and then spread the lessons to other places as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll go to the United Kingdom, then Japan, and then the Norwegian Refugee Council. United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the panellists. We certainly agree with your assessment of protracted crises being the new norm. And providing support for humanitarian and protracted crises, of course, remains a top priority for the UK government and will do in 2019. We very much appreciate the improved quality of the HNO this year, and want to thank Mark and your team for the work that you've put into this. We hope that as you develop next year's report, you'll continue to improve the accuracy and also look at some prioritisation and transparency around this. We very much will use the information within the GHO to help ensure that UK humanitarian funding allocations for 2019 and 20 are based on the best information available on scale and funding. So we will absolutely use this. And we will also hope to work with other donors to ensure that needs are met, and with you to ensure that the HRPs are a bit more comparable, as well as well coordinated and monitored. And as you panelists have said, 2019 is going to be a very important year for us. Improving links between humanitarian development systems, ensuring protection, continued humanitarian access, and respect of international humanitarian law, and also continuing to tackle PSE and AN safeguarding, ensuring accountability to affected populations, and as Kaya has said, the engagement particularly with women and girls, and empowering them in decision making, but also making sure that we're targeting the needs of people with disabilities. The rollout of the Global Compact on Refugees will be critical, and again, it'd be interesting to understand perhaps from Filippo how you intend to kind of link that in with what OCHA is doing and some of the broader UN reforms, maybe not now, but as we go through next year. And then finally, just to say that the UK is, of course, committed to supporting you in the next year on all these different issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I won't go to you now, Filippo, but perhaps that's a conversation over coffee. Let me go to Japan.
Thank you, and I thank you for all the presentations. We are committed to supporting the UN system for humanitarian needs. But I have a question regarding financing, because the growing, I guess, the amount of the financing needs is, I think, is a concern. I think that the developed economies are beginning to have an aging population and increasing budget deficits. And so my impression is probably that the new or the emerging donors are taking on some of the burden that of the increased needs. And I think this kind of picture should be, I think, described so that we understand that the international community is shouldering this burden, more I guess, widely. A second question is how are you working with the private sector, both in terms of introducing new technologies to help those in need and also to support their livelihoods, because I think not only in terms of finance, but for promoting livelihoods, and the lives of the people who are in need, this is very important. And so this, as part of the development humanitarian nexus, I think we are very interested in seeing that people in need are provided with skills, training, and education, and that they become part of the solution, as it were, to the root causes. Thank you. I'm not sure who should answer this, but
I was just about to ask you that.
I'm not exactly sure who should answer this, but I just raised these two questions.
Yes, to Mark, and then go to others.
Well, I think perhaps it'd be good if David chips in as well, because WFP's collaboration with the private sector, like UNHCR's, is really, really impressive, and it's good if he gets a chance to say a word to you about that. Let me deal with the first question. It's not that it's just a moral responsibility for rich countries to help people caught up in crises, although it is a moral responsibility. Those little starving babies I met in Yemen last week, them and their children and their brothers and sisters and their parents, they are just the same as every other human being, just like you and just like me, except that life's lottery has been kinder to us than to them. And there is a moral responsibility. It's also, though, in the national interest of developed countries and richer countries to contribute to solving these problems, because these kind of problems spread, and the consequences have to be dealt with if they spread in a more difficult and expensive way than if we deal with them when they start. And it is good news from my point of view that the burden of this is being more widely spread. What you'll see if you look on the financial tracking system, which my office produces and updates every day, is that the contributions we've had from the non-traditional donors in 2019 have increased significantly, not at the expense of contributions from the largest of our traditional donors, but in addition to those. And we want to see that trend continue. But let me hand to David.
That's probably a 3-hour answer session. But as Mark was talking about, traditional donors have not backed down. In fact, I know everybody remembers 2 years ago thinking the United States was going to zero out international aid. In fact, the United States has not backed down. The United States has actually stepped up with the major agencies. We've gone from $1.8, $1.9 billion to $2.75 billion, most likely this year. I know UNHCR, UNICEF, the numbers are going up. And actually, the message that I had from many of my friends in the United States Senate and the House and the White House was, now you go tell our friends who've been with us to step up too. And many of you in this room have been stepping up. But the needs are so great, I don't think we can expect the traditional donors to bear the burden forever. We've got to tap into the private sector for more fundraising. And I don't think it's realistic to think that we're going to get hundreds of millions of dollars from foundations, even though we can get strategic relationships, but it's going to have to be in the digital world with the millennials, with the smartphones and things like that. The other two areas, though, are how do we use the private sector for more integration to be more effective, which we are doing. I can give you example after example where we've actually saved hundreds of millions of dollars in supply chain and logistics per year in the last couple of years by working more effectively with the private sector. The third sector is the long-term solution, is why developed nations are developed, not because the government made it happen, but because the government created an atmosphere to inspire the private sector. And the UN, as an outsider that came in, my opinion, the UN shunned the private sector for too long. But there's an atmosphere, in my opinion, clearly in the UN now that says we will never solve these problems unless the private sector is integrally involved, which is why we, on the food security side, on the humanitarian and development nexus, are bringing more private sector industries and companies in to help us address food security, to be more efficient, more effective. But yet, that's not always so simple in some very, very fragile areas. But we are, in fact, in clear agreement with the private sector has got to be more integrally involved. And I think all of us in this panel would agree with that. So,
your question has prompted a lot of interest. Filippo would like to say a few words, and then Caroline. And then I'm going to close with the Norwegian Refugee Council, because time is not our friend.
briefly, not just about this question, but there were remarks made about the humanitarian development and also the private sector, and also responsibility, burden sharing. That was the Japanese question. That's what the compact, at least in refugee settings, aims at doing. That's precisely the spirit that guides the compact, is to try to develop a set of practical tools for burden sharing to happen. So not just as a statement of intention, but as a reality. It will take time, but I think the fact that there is consensus around, or almost consensus around, that compact is good. Just to remind you, you know this, but just to remind the audience that under the practical applications of the compact that we have already rolled out in 15 countries in the past 2 years, we estimate that we've been able to mobilize $6.5 billion in development multi-year assistance from international financial institutions, big bilaterals, and the private sector. This is new additional money. That does not for one moment make this appeal redundant or less necessary, because development money has a long-term impact, and we do need short-term impact as well. But that mobilization is very significant. And also private sector, I think, and that's not what you did. Your question was good, but many questions always are, so when will the UN, when will the humanitarian community cooperate with the private sector? It's already happening. We can give you many examples. In Kenya, we're working with the World Bank on how to stimulate private investment of the local business community, of the Kenyan and regional business community in the camp in Kakuma and in the local community. So there's very practical applications around the spirit of the compact that are already happening.
Thank you. Caroline, briefly.
I'll be very brief. So I think at CARE, what we're doing is working a lot with the private sector across the Confederation. So this is they partner with us all over the world. So that's super important, but also in programs. So we have programs in all sorts of cases of crisis and emergency where we're focusing on women's economic empowerment. And this could mean developing village saving and loan associations where everybody contributes a certain amount of money. This money is then put into mobile phones, so we're using the technology as well and working with partners on how we can get that into really advanced technologies. So as part of our programs, we too feel that the private sector is very important, and it's important to stimulate whatever private sector activities are already existing and encourage women to be part of that as well. So you're right, people should be, as you say, part of the solution. And I think that's a very important point.
Thank you very much. And I would like to give the floor very briefly to the Norwegian Refugee Council.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very interesting debate. I apologize if I will close it with a very pragmatic question. There's a mention to multi-year planning in the GHO, and it was also referred to very passionately by Mr. Beasley during his speech around the Nexus. Multi-year planning has an impact if it is matched with predictable and, when possible, flexible funding. So it is very important that we work together at making sure that this is happening. So my question is, what are the steps already undertaken by UN agencies to allow NGO partners to access multi-year funding, especially in those countries where we have refugee response plans and where the CRRF is rolling out? And then I will close with a plea not to forget the commitments we all signed in the Grand Bargain, because it's really important that we keep on working on it to make it happen.
Thank you very much. Mark will answer your question and close this session.
So thank you very much for the question. I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer when we say that the crises are protracted, that we have a medium-term mindset to dealing with them. And I want to thank the donors who increasingly have been providing finance for us on a multi-year basis. Most of the money, for example, in the Central Emergency Response Fund, and we're going to have a record-breaking fundraising year for the SURF this year. Thank you, all of you. But most of the money, particularly in the new commitments that have been made, is on a multi-year basis. Now, it is incumbent on us, through all the funding sources, when we're getting multi-year income, we know it's incumbent on us to have a more medium-term planning approach on the expenditure side as well. And I think that will be one of the things we'll need to work out how to make progress on next year. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Atu Mitiku, Caroline, Alexandra, David Filippo, and you, Claire, for keeping us all to order. Please do take a couple of minutes to look at the exhibition we have outside, which introduces the new humanitarian data source, Humanitarian Insight. And please do let us know all your comments and questions on this product. I do want to emphasize that these products are the work of the whole humanitarian system. Thousands of people in many, many agencies contribute to this. My office draws it together and coordinates and assembles it, but there would be nothing to draw together and coordinate and assemble but for the work of all of the other agencies. So thank you finally to all of those colleagues. And have a good day.